Hey everyone, welcome to Coding with Roy. I usually do coding problems on Twitter, but today was my first attempt trying to do a 6-cube problem on Code Wars, and I thought it might be a more helpful teaching tool to try to explain the concepts on video format. So I would love to hear your feedback on how this looks and if the instruction material is good. But without further ado, let's jump right into the problem. So in this problem, we have given an array of integers. Find the one that appears an odd number of times. And there will always be only one integer that appears an odd number of times. The first couple of times that I read this, it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, so it took me a few passes before I understood what was going on. But let's open this up in the code editor and see if we can demonstrate what this question is asking for. So here we have Visual Studio Code open, and we can see the examples here. This shows you what kinds of inputs there will be, and then the result that it should return. So in this first example, we have an array with the value of 7, or the element of 7. It should return 7 because it occurs one time. So what we're going to do is we're going to count each element and add the amount of times that it shows up. We're going to increment it by 1 each time it shows up. And if that occurrence value is odd, then we return that particular element. So in this case, 7 only shows up once. 1 is an odd number, so we return 7. The same goes with 0, since it only shows up once. We return it because it only shows up once and it's an odd number. In this particular example, we have 1, 1, and 2. 1 shows up twice. Since it's an even number, we don't return it, but 2, since it shows up once, being an odd number, this is the value that we want. And again, the instructions state that there will only be one integer that appears an odd number of times. So as soon as we find the first value that shows up an odd number of times, we are done with the problem. Looking at a slightly longer array, we have 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. We see that 0 shows up 3 times here, 1, 2, 3, and 1 shows up 2 times here. So what value should we return? Yes, we should return 0 because it occurs 3 times. With this, we have a slightly longer array with a various assortment of numbers here. So let's try to visualize this a little bit. What if we wanted to have a count of each number showing up during the array? So I'm going to set up a comment block here. Let's try this. So we have 1 that shows up 1 time so far. So we have 1, 1, and then 2, 1. The next element is 2, so it shows up 1 time. So we have 2, 1, and we have it showing up again. So we have 2 showing up 2 times, and then we have 3 showing up 1 time. Now before we go any further, this should start to look like a particular kind of JavaScript object. And I kind of gave it away there, but yes, this is what we call an object. So what we know is that what we want for this particular problem is an object itself. So the first thing that we want to do is create an object that keeps track of each number and how many times it shows up in the array. But before we do that, we first need to be able to pinpoint the specific value that we want from this array, or this object rather. And I find that a lot of the primary challenges of solving these problems is to figure out how to get the program to point to a specific value in a given problem. Because once you can get JavaScript to understand what you're pointing at, then you can begin to manipulate it, analyze it as you need to, and figure out a way to bring about the solution. So first, let's figure out a way to get JavaScript to point at the correct object value. So let's begin by trying to create a test object. Let's call this one object animal. And it's going to be using the literal notation. I'm going to do horse. fast, and then turtle float. Okay, so this is how we would create an object, and how do we go about pointing to a specific value. So let's say that we want to know this value fast. Well, the two primary ways of doing this is dot notation and bracket notation. So with the dot notation, we call the object by its name here, and then we use the dot and then the property name, which is horse or turtle. We'll use horse for now. And this, just by calling this, we'll call this string fast. The value of horse is fast, so we're going to call the value fast by using dot notation object dot property name horse. Alright, so let's take a look at what this looks like on the console. Okay, so what we're going to do is console log object animal.horse. And then open the page up to live server. Now, live server is an extension that you can get from this extension here, live server, and install that way. But going back to the code, going to open with live server, and check out the console, and indeed, we see fast here, as we expected. The second way of pointing to the value of a property is to use the bracket method. So, doing this again. Onto down, and this time what we're going to do is put into square brackets the string horse. For comparison, let's try doing turtle this time. Okay, so if we do turtle and console log this, we will get float. Alright, so these are two different ways that you can point to the value of a property, and we're going to work with this latter portion here, this bracket notation, because this is going to allow us to use variables to point to the various properties that we've constructed. So let's try making the function to solve the problem next. Okay, so let's begin by initializing the function. We'll call it a function find odd. See that I actually have the actual answer written down on the below, just so I can reference in case I need it. But we'll pass into find odd an array. And in it, we're going to initialize our first variable. We know that this is going to be an object, so let's just call this object int, or object integer, and we'll just set it up to be equal the empty objects using the curly braces. All right. Next, what we're going to do is iterate through the array. Now we're passing in an array, so we're going to iterate through each of the elements in the array, and we want the property name of each element that we come across to be the number. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this array. We want the property names to reflect the numbers that this function comes across. And we want the values to be the number of times that each number is seeing. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to do in for loop, let I equal 0, I less than array dot length, I plus plus. Okay, so you will remember that to point to a particular property, we're going to use the bracket notation, the square bracket notation here. So to do that, what we're going to do is first define an element. So let element equal array at I. Okay, so this is going to be the element at the index of I in the array. So array at 1 is going to be this 2 here. Array at 0 is going to be this 1 here. It's just going to go through the entire array and assign each element to this variable. All right, now we set up our condition. If object int at element this does is to first see if there is a value or a property at this particular object index, which is going to have that name, array at I. If it exists, then we are going to increment it by 1. Else, object int at element is going to equal 1. So let's talk about this logic here. So what it's going to do is it's going to see if object int has a property named element. If it does, then it's going to increment element's value by 1. If it doesn't, then it's going to create that particular property with that name and then set it equal to 1. What this will do is that if let's just go through this example array as an example. We come across this first element, number 1, and it is going to go through this logic and says, okay, does 1 exist in this particular object int? It doesn't, so it doesn't qualify for this particular logic, so it goes down to here and says, okay, if it doesn't exist, then we're going to create that object and set it equal to 1. So we have an object with the property of 1 with the value of 1. It's going to do the same thing again for 2. Does 2 exist? It doesn't. So it's going to create 2 and set its value equal to 1 because it's the first time that it's seen it. Now, here, it's going to see, oh, 2 exists. It already exists. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 2's value, which is 1, and we're going to add 1 to it. And then we have now 1 with the value of 1 and 2 with the value of 2. And it's going to go through this iterative process with 3 and again with 4, and then eventually we're going to have an object with a list of properties that contains each of the number values and the number of times that it sees each value in the array. Okay, so now that we have created our object, let's review the objective, what we're supposed to get from this particular problem. We are to find which of these numbers show up in the array an odd number of times. So really quick, let's try console logging the result that we have here. So we'll try first initiating a variable. Let's call it test. Let's call it test array. And then we'll snip this off here. This will be our test array, and then we're going to call our function and run test array through that. Okay, so first what we're going to do is console log object int. Yep. Okay, so we see on the right side here we have an object with a list of numbers. These are the values that showed up in the array, 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And these are the number of times that each number showed up in the array. So 4, we see it only showed up once. 1, we see showed up twice. 2 showed up 4 times, and so on. So what do we want? We want to get these values here and find the one that showed up an odd number of times. So we want to find the odd number among these values. So first, we're going to have to figure out a way to point to the property name, because that way we can say, okay, we want you to check on the property name of 1, and then what is its value? Is the number even or odd? So first we want to get this property name, these property names of each of these properties. So to do that, we do what's called a key. We've defined, let's define keys. And this method, object.key, and we're going to pass in object int. does is it returns an array that contains a list of the properties that are in the object. So in our case, when we are looking at this particular array, remember we had the, let's go ahead and try just console logging object int again. So looking here, we had these property names, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What it does is it's going to take these properties and put them into an array by itself. So if we were to console log keys, we have an array of just these values, just the property names. This way we can point to each of these property names and have our function look at its value in the object int object. So that is the point of these this particular function or method rather, is to pull the property names, put them into a single array, and then we can then use that to point back to our object and get the values and figure out which one has the odd value. So just as an example, if we were to run the object.keys using our example object here, object animal, what would be the results? Pause the video now and see if you can get the answer. What if we were to console log the object.keys method by passing through object animal here? Pause now and try to answer the question. Alright, so if you said running the object.keys and using object animal, passing object animal, we would get horse and turtle, you'd be correct. Let's go ahead and try that. So I'm going to take this here and copy it here, that object animal, the various properties here, and let's make this test key equal object.keys object animal, and we console.log test key. And there we go. We have an array of horse and turtle, which is what we expected. So this is kind of the visualization that we're going with when we're creating this test array. Because since both the properties and the values are numbers, it's kind of easy to get these confused. So it's important to know what the keys does, and the entire point of creating this particular keys variable is so that we can point back to the property when we need to use it for our function. So let's do that in the next section. So here we are going to create a second for loop. Let I equals 0. This time we're going to set it less than keys dot length I plus plus. And then we're going to initiate a variable, let prop name equal keys at index I. And I'm going to continue on and create a second one, and then we'll review what we're doing here. So we're going to do prop value equals object int at prop name. Alright, so what we're doing here is first we're creating a variable that contains the property name, and we're setting that equal to keys at the index of I. I'm actually going to do something a little additional here, is since this keys method here returns the stringified version of each element, what we need is a number. So we're going to make that into a number here. And that will turn the result of this keys at index I into a number, which is what we need. And then the prop value is the value associated with that property name. And you call that, remember, that to get the property value, we pass in the object's name and then the property name, and that'll give us the value associated with that property. So that's how we do that. Now, here's the final step. What we want is the conditional logic of if prop value, we want an odd number. So mod 2 does not equal 0. So this will give us an odd number. So if prop value 2 does not equal 0, then that's the one we want. We want to return that prop name. So let's try testing that on our console log. Okay, so what we're going to do is replace this return value here with console.log and put in prop name. And then we should see it. Yep, we should see 4 here because 4 showed up one time, which is an odd number of times. Okay, so that's how you get the solution for this problem. And we're just going to change this back to return for the Code Wars problem. Alright, that should be how to do it. So this process was a lot more involved than the other problems that I've attempted, being in the 7Q. So this is my first time at trying a 6Q problem, and it included a lot more steps than I'm used to. So I figured the video format would be more useful as an educational tool, as well as being able to provide examples this way. I would love to hear your feedback on this particular format. I don't know if I'll be able to do videos for every single problem, but for this one, I thought it might be very educational to be able to go through examples and to see how we can apply this to other kinds of problems. I'd love to hear your feedback, and if there are any other questions, please let me know in the comments or tag me on Twitter. And with that out of the way, I hope you all have a good rest of the time coding with your coding challenges.